Welcome everyone to the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pickering. That's right, Lo-Fi as in low fidelity, low quality, in your face, messy as can be global news show. It's Tuesday, Lo-Fi Nation, and you know what that means. It's time for Tuesday's Top 10 list. Every Tuesday, we look at global indicators and surveys to see what countries hold the top 10 rankings in particular categories. We cover things like oldest countries, freest countries, happiest countries, and so much more. And no worries out there. We'll cover what each category means before we jump into the list. Today's top 10 list, the 10 least free countries in the world. And our data come from Freedom House's 2020 Freedom Scores. This is to accompany last week's list of the 10 freest countries in the world. Freedom House scores countries from 0 to 100 based on the level of civil liberties and civil rights in a country. The more freedoms the people have, the higher the score. But in today's case, the lower the number of freedoms that the people have, the lower the country score. Let's hit it. The lists coming in at number 10 and tied for this spot are Libya and Tajikistan, both with freedom scores of 9 out of 100. And coming in tied for number 8 are Somalia and Saudi Arabia, with freedom scores of 7 out of 100. Coming in at number 6, with a score of 6 out of 100, Equatorial Guinea. Now to our bottom 5. Number 5, North Korea, whom I bet you thought was going to be number 1 on the list, but having a score of 3 out of 100. Number 4, tied with freedom scores of 2 out of 100, Eritrea and Turkmenistan. Number 2, Syria with a 0 out of 100. And coming in at number 1, and no 5 count to guess, we're talking about people living in serious repression by their governments here. But the least free country in the world, according to Freedom House's 2020 Freedom Scores, is South Sudan, with a negative 2 out of 100. Whew. This is a tough list, people. Let's dig into it, though. Firstly, you can plainly see that out of our top 10 least free countries in the world, none of them score higher or above a 10 out of 100. You should also notice that freedoms in these countries are not tied to economics. Saudi Arabia is one of the richest countries in the world, and it is also one of the least free countries in the world. Women just gaining the right to drive in 2018? If that's not a statement of oppression, I don't know what is. Also, we can see on this list that not all of these countries are war-torn either. Of course, we see Syria and South Sudan as number 2 and number 1 respectively, but several of these other least free countries are not in a state of open conflict at all. But let's talk about our top places on this list in comparison to last week's list of most free countries in the world. Last week, we had Finland, Norway, and Sweden with 100s out of 100. This week, we have Syria with a 0 out of 100, and South Sudan with a negative 2 out of 100. People, that's the difference of the entire freedom scale, and some more in the case of South Sudan. Last week's top 10 list, those countries were all in the 90s, the very high 90s. This week's top 10, all of our countries never get past 10 or to 10. And let me do a little math for you, because I know if I'd asked, you likely wouldn't do it. So how many people are we really talking about in these countries? Well, in our 11 freest countries combined, there's a population of about 120 million. In our 10 least free countries combined, there's a population of about 130 million people. Now, a couple of things about these numbers in these two groups. Number 1, the free countries group has one more country than the least free countries, 11 versus 10. Number 2, the least free group still has about 10 million more people living in them. And it makes us wonder, when comparing these two populations, why aren't more people living in these free places in comparison to those living in these least free places? And you ever imagine the idea that a place is so not free that people can't even leave? I mean, Eritrea has forced military service once you hit 18 years old. That equates to, and is generally recognized as, institutionalized slavery of the population. And some of these places are literally, not even joking here, more dangerous to try and leave than it is to stay. And that's a fact. And an overall takeaway when comparing the list of freest countries in the world to the least free countries in the world is that we are all human beings on this planet, and there is major disparity and inequality in the freedoms we have as people. Some of us are free to do as we please, and some of us are free to do nothing that we please. And there is one other glaring thing about our list today, though. And that's our pop quiz for today. Syria has a score of 0 out of 100, and South Sudan has a score of -2 out of 100. How are these scores even possible? Especially in the case of South Sudan, considering it goes beyond the possible scores allowed. Write in. You know what to do. I'm curious your thoughts. And that's this Tuesday's Top 10 list. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, wash those hands, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. Pickering, signing off.